Welcome to Preserving Our Planet on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Hawaii. Is Hawaii prepared for climate change? What else do we need to do? Our guest for the show is Henry Curtis, Executive Director, Life of the Land, very interested in environment and climate change. Welcome to the show, Henry.
Aloha, Jay.
History makes it clear that Hawaii is especially vulnerable to the risks and exposures of climate change. We need to understand and evaluate those risks and exposures and take all the steps necessary to prepare for and deal with them. How exposed are we? Is the public fully aware of that exposure?
I think the best way of describing it is in a two-step process. First, there's a tendency of people in general or governments in general to think that tomorrow's disaster will resemble yesterday's disaster. And therefore, because we had a wildfire, the next disaster will be a wildfire. And we should throw all our marbles towards wildfire prevention. The second issue is that if you look at the wildfire, and one person described it this way: imagine you're driving down a dark road at night and you have a cup of coffee in your hand and it starts to rain and a cat crosses the road and you swerve to miss it and you crash. You can't really blame any one thing, but combination wise, the whole thing caused the accident. So, in many ways, the Lahaina fire was a combination of ignitions across the island, multiple wildfires in different places, wind in high winds, conflicting data, rapidly changing conditions, and a breakdown in both communications, internal and external, and a command and control center. So it was multiple issues that led to the disaster. Now, the future disaster, and we assume with climate change getting worse and worse each year, we're going to have another disaster. We don't know whether it will be one disaster or multiple disasters, and we need to be able to prepare so that we can handle all the different impacts that might be associated with them while keeping costs low.
Well, that's a lot of possibilities, isn't it? I mean, in other words, if you prepare for 10 disasters and the next one is only number one, how do you identify the ones you're really concerned about?
I look at it from a slightly different angle: is what can we do that will solve multiple future possibilities? If is there or a set of things that solve multiple potential impacts? So, for example, on Oahu, we've lost the entire island's outage due to an earthquake and due to lightning. We've also had islands lose most of the power from tsunamis, er, um, hurricanes, lava, flooding, all kinds of things. So, are there specific things that we can do that will address these multiple issues?
We talked before the show about the use of AI. It seems to me that Chat GBT wouldn't be powerful enough, but a large language model that takes into the weather historically and in our area and all the factors you could think of could give us probabilities on which combination, if you will, is likely to strike next. Unfortunately, I don't think we're putting money into that, but let's assume for a moment that we have as much AI as we want. Don't you think that would be helpful in identifying exactly or more exactly what the risks would be?
I think AI is a useful tool for coming up with sort of an initial study. So, for example, you put in as many facts as you can, and you let AI programs come out with sort of broad strokes or high level reviews of what can happen. But then you need to actually um, go the next step, is basing on data and basing on people's skills and experience to really refine those.
Right. Well, that's always a problem with AI. Maybe less in the future, but for the moment, we have to build in its flaws. Anyway, one of the things that interests me is the media's coverage of all these extreme events. And it's a bunch of things. I mean, it goes from the gradual events like sea level rise and climate change in general with the temperatures and what the international organizations are doing, trying to do. Um, and then it goes to the extreme weather. And that troubles me more than anything else because we have extreme weather. Lately, we've had it in the South, and homes and communities and institutions, brick and mortar, being destroyed. And when you do that, you destroy the community in general. Very hard to rebuild. It's sort of like what happened in Maui. Very hard to rebuild. But is the public aware, A, that what is happening in those areas, that extreme weather, is really largely the result of climate change? That's one question. And B, as, do we know, this country, do we know that if we take steps to minimize climate change, that will have hopefully a positive effect on all this extreme weather? Your thoughts?
In the first one, most people probably don't associate climate change with specifically all these extreme events coming. Some people recognize it, but it's often you have sort of three groups. One who always thinks that anything that happens was caused by climate change. One group that isn't aware of climate change, and one group that thinks that things might get worse or be more intense because of climate change. So we have these competing views, and we also have things like you have one plan, you need to plant more trees in Waianae to deal with cooling so people don't get heat stroke. And you also have to remove trees to prevent them from catching fire and burning down the community. So you have these competing plans that have contradictory solutions. Obviously, we need to aggressively deal with greenhouse gas emissions and reverse some of the damages done by climate change. But we have one analogy that has been suggested is when you put ice cubes in a container and you pour your soda in, the ice cubes don't melt immediately, they take time. And in the same way, the greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere already will cook the planet for decades after we min- minimize adding more greenhouse gases. So even if we were to stop putting greenhouse gases in right now, things would get worse for the next decade.
I feel that Hawaii is especially vulnerable for two reasons. One is, that we're in the middle of the Pacific and things could happen in terms of weather. Things are happening in terms of weather. And the second thing is that we're far away from any relief. And that relief seems even further away now with the Trump administration because of his cutbacks on NOAA and the Weather Bureau, and on FEMA, which troubled me greatly, and which troubled me greatly. And so I'm thinking that people here should be more aware rather than less aware. Um, People here ought to realize, as in the case of food shortages and you know all the shortages we could suffer, supply line shortages, that we are especially vulnerable, and we have to take special steps. Now, I like Josh Green's idea of a green fee. I think it's interesting that he imposes it only on tourists, not on the community in general. But query, is that going to help? Suppose he raises billions, which I don't think that's going to happen. But suppose he raises a lot of money. How would Hawaii spend that money to prepare for, protect itself from climate change?
I think that is the harder question to ask because it's easy to raise the money in theory and a lot harder to figure out what you spend it on. Um, for example, when the hurricane came through Puerto Rico, the conventional wisdom is people in rural areas would survive because you have all these food there, and people in urban centers would have problems because they don't have a immediate supply of food. But it turned out people in urban areas had stockpiles of food, whereas people in rural areas saw their vegetation knocked down by the high winds. So part of it is we have to learn from one disaster to how to preserve another, but we also have to become far more sustainable here. And that gets to your other question about data. If all this national data is being eliminated by Trump, then we're going to have to rely on local data. But that means the data that's going into the model will be different. And therefore, the models will have to be developed and recalibrated using only local data. So we have a huge road ahead of us, and we have to do multiple things at the same time while somehow keeping costs down so we don't bankrupt the local population.
Yeah, in large part, we're on our own. That's the reality of it. And you also you mentioned electricity, and you and I have followed Hawaiian Electric and the generation of electricity around the state for a lifetime. And let me say that I worry about that a lot because if you look back to incidents of bad weather, of gee whiz, anything and everything could knock Hawaiian Electric offline, and sometimes even for days and many days. Then you get a breakdown in the society. I remember one particular period where the electricity went down. And on the first day, all the neighbors were in the street with coffee cups having a clutch. On the second day, they were not so many. On the third day, there was nobody because they were all terrified that the neighborhood was deteriorating and that there were people around who would do malicious mischief and the like. And so I think society breaks down when you don't have electrical power. Now, we know that because of and many other reasons too, I suppose, because of the Maui fires, Hawaiian Electric is not in great shape. And it doesn't have the resources to maintain and to improve its systems. And so we're more likely to have brownouts and blackouts now than we were before, simply as a financial matter. Some people have suggested that Hawaiian Electric has to change its model or go bankrupt in order to deal with its inability to raise the money. So, I guess my question to you is how important is electrical energy for the community in a time of climate change crisis?
Having electricity is critical because you can't move water and wastewater. You can't operate your telecom systems. Everything requires electricity or energy, and therefore it's absolutely critical. I worry about people who say we should drive the utility into bankruptcy because that would add an enormous period of financial instability. And it's sort of the shock and awe of the federal government, which is let's destroy everything and rebuild something in its place. But in that period where you're destroying everything, you're extremely vulnerable.
Yeah, vulnerable leads to the loss of civil society, and a lot of these other things we're talking about leads to the loss of civil society. So I give you now some of these things are not immediately threatening. Sea level rise, somebody's going to have to figure out what to do with Waikiki and all those beachfront properties around all the islands, and that's a long term project. But that's a project that's going to cost a lot of money, and there'll be a lot of damage, financial damage to people with property along the shore. Okay. It's the extreme weather that comes on you quickly and by surprise. It's the extreme weather that is of greater concern, I think. And if I give you the worst case analysis, Henry, what happens in the case of extreme weather that knocks out the power, that knocks out the water directly or indirectly, that knocks out the supply lines, that knocks out food and water for consumers, that knocks out even traffic lights on the street. In other words, everything stops. What happens to our civil society?
In theory, the utility has enough fuel on hand to operate their power plants for a month. So, in theory, you could produce local power right around a generation station. But what happens before that is that water, except for Molokai, has only a couple days supply. Food, we're just in time food delivery. So yes, we can live on, I guess, military rations from little plastic containers for a while, but our food supply would run out very quickly. Our medicines would run out very quickly. And therefore, while the electrical system would prevent everything from operating, it's these other things that would destroy us very quickly.
And that means people would get sick. and they would die. Am I right? Nobody likes to talk about this, but when you have a breakdown in civil society, you have violence in the street, and people, for starvation and other reasons, maybe medical reasons, they wouldn't have medical support. They would die, and that is a part of climate change, isn't it? That's what happens in other areas in the world when they can't deal with climate events. They get sick, they starve, they die. Right?
Yes, and the people closest to nature living in areas with wild animals or plants or water or whatever would be able to survive, whereas the urban centers would really get hit hard.
So there's two levels of a question I have for you. One is, what does the government do to protect us from that? Because that is the most threatening thing of all. And then the second part of my question is, what do we do individually? Some people think we have to rush down to Safeway and buy supplies that'll last for 40 days and 40 nights. But what is a better, more rational solution for the government and for the individual?
Let me answer what we do as individuals, because it appears that far fewer individuals are prepared than the percent who think they're prepared. And we obviously don't need piles and piles of bottled water with millions of microplastics swimming around inside it as a solution. Um, so we need to really, and with a third of the nation, a third of Hawaii residents being food insecure, not having enough food now, it's crazy to suggest to them they should put food away for an emergency, but not eat it now. Um, so we need to overhaul the system, and that huge tax break that we passed a couple of years ago, uh, which gave marginal support for the working class and gave a huge tax break to the rich. We should claw back the tax break for the rich and reallocate that money to building a sustainable society.
I totally agree, Henry. Good point. So, what about the government? The government has that tax break money that's clawed back. The government has some reserve. It's very modest right now. Government has the green fee from Josh Green, and the government has power. The government has an ability to enforce whatever rules it adopts. What should the legislature do? How can we be prepared for this? And I suppose I'm also asking, what are other countries and communities outside Hawaii doing, if anything? I have the feeling that it's all very quiet out there, and that people don't even realize the risk, and they have no plan around the world. What about us?
The first thing, or one thing we have to address, is housing, because probably in a high-speed hurricane, a third of the roofs would get ripped off. So you need somehow to secure the buildings we have as well as to build new units. We need to build secure facilities. Um, we need a better amount of local food grown here and stored here and available here. Um, we need to think of ourselves as really being a canoe, and do we have enough supplies in the canoe to last for a month without having external supplies arrive?
Yeah. Well, a few years ago, SOET at the university was out with advice on how you could anchor your house so the roof wouldn't blow off. I thought that was very positive. I'm not sure that program exists anymore. But just as you say, if you have a house that could be blown away, you probably want to take the steps to fix it and make it more secure. And I am reminded, you mentioned Puerto Rico. I am reminded that in Puerto Rico, in that the hurricane, there were two kinds of solar farms. One kind of solar farm used a certain kind of fastener that held the solar panels down on the stands. And another kind of solar farm used another kind of solar fastener that held the panels down on the stands. One of them worked. One of those fasteners worked. The other one didn't work. So the farms that had the stronger fastener, stayed through the hurricane. the ones with the weaker fastener, it tore the solar panels right off. And that is a kind of lesson of sorts, isn't it? That you have to build things or rebuild them so they're strong enough to deal with high winds. Are we in that place? Do we consider those factors?
We've asked Hawaiian Electric about how secure solar and wind farms are due to wildfire or other hazards. And their response is it's up to them to secure their systems. So it's harder to figure out which ones will survive and which ones won't survive, and at what level they stop working. Um, we've been told by some solar industry people, well, if some of the solar panels get whacked, the other ones will still be around, and so you at least have partial power. Um, but this is a whole new issue and new arena where we have to begin looking at the systems that we're putting in and saying how secure are they for the different kinds of attacks that can occur. And while there is a lot talking about weather, we have to also look about physical attacks. I mean, it was Ukraine used drones to hit targets 5,000 miles from their border yesterday. We have to worry about physical attacks against, as well as cyber attacks against the utility, because the utility is being hit with tens of thousands of cyber attacks on a regular basis. And so the systems have to be hardened for maliciousness as well as for weather impacts.
There are institutions like Life of the Land that talk about this and that talk to legislators and officials about this. What is Life of the Land doing in order to help harden our systems and raise public awareness about the risks and the need for preparation?
Life and Land is the one party reviewing HECO's wildfire mitigation plan. And as part of that review, we're talking about how that plan fits in to a broader set of, in other words, the wildfire plan can't be reasonable and in the public interest unless it's part of a full hazard evaluation that looks at all hazards and what the utility is spending on each one of them. We need a complete holistic solution. We're also in a docket dealing with hardening of the grid, and we're in another proceeding at the Public Utilities Commission dealing with equity, how you make sure that people at the lower ends of the spectrum, the environmental justice and environmental and the climate community are not whacked in this whole process, that we need solutions that help everybody. Um, and so we're approaching it from multiple perspectives. We're also meeting with community groups. We're part of a climate health working group because you have to involve doctors and nurses in finding solutions to deal with heat and everything else. We're in an we're in the energy equity hui, which is working on reaching out to the communities at a broader level. We're a resource advisor to the Molokai community working on their plans. So you need to have a multiple perspective and multiple approach.
You mentioned Molokai and Neighbor Island. I remember, maybe it shows my age, a time when we were an island state rather than a state of islands. I remember when it was easy to go from one island to another, not so expensive. I wasn't around when they had the ferry, but the ferry, I mean the original ferry. The ferry was very important for people to visit other islands and family at other islands and so forth. But somewhere along the line, Henry, it became a state of islands. And the notion was, people thought this was a positive thing. The notion was that every island had its own personality. And that was encouraged, its own persona. And yet, when you talk about making statewide plans and statewide recovery systems and institutions, the problem is that things are not the same on Molokai as they are on Oahu. And they're not the same on all the islands. Every island has its own persona, and to wit, the problem in Puerto Rico, where some solar farms are different than other solar farms. You wonder what islands are better prepared and what are islands are not so well prepared. I see that as a significant problem. I mean, if for example, and I'm just making this up, if for example Molokai wasn't well prepared or Maui wasn't well prepared for whatever comes down the pike, and it could be any one of a number of climate change risks, that island will get whacked more than the other islands. And so, how do you deal with these different persona, different level of thought, awareness, planning, recovery from one island to another?
That is a uh, very interesting and very challenging issue. Certainly, even housing standards vary from community to community, island to island. Um, and islands have different threats facing them. So, in some ways, you need to have a state policy, but you also need to have county policies and you also need to have island policies. So, Molokai and Lanai, in some ways, need to have their own governments so that they can handle their islands' issues separate from what happens on Maui.
Yeah, you anticipated my next question. So let's assume that under this administration, which will last a few years, this federal administration, Washington doesn't really care what happens, either in anticipating weather, dealing with the environment in general. They're anti-environment. It's clear, and for that matter, not really funding, the recovery efforts on storms and other climate change disasters. Um, doesn't that mean that Hawaii has to take a hard look at creating organizations, institutions, agencies that will step in where the federal government has abandoned us? And assuming you agree with that, well, I won't make any assumptions, but if you agree with that, then what agencies and organizations and funding and staff and all that do we need to put in place?
That's a big one. Um, and going along with that, and the flip side of that is, and what agencies do we have now that aren't working and need to be overhauled? Because we have some agencies that are very effective and others that are very ineffective, and some agencies that are too large and handle too many issues and need to really be broken up into separate agencies. Lifeland
Well,
would be more happy with others coming up with the sort of broad strokes on them, and then we can back individual plans rather than us being the ones that come up with this approach. Um, I think one agency that is too large right now is the Department of Health. They cover way too many issues and human issues, birth and death and life, and those things should be separate from the environmental impacts, which they also handle. Um, that would be one split. Another split would be to take transportation out of the Public Utilities Commission. 90% of all their filings are this truck company just formed and this truck company just went out of business and this truck company is expanding the number of trucks it operates. That does not belong in the same agency that regulates electric, gas, and telecom. And we were understood that as of last year, that was supposed to be transferred to the Department of Transportation, but I don't know what went wrong because it's still at the Public Utilities Commission.
well, transportation. I forgot to mention that. That's one thing that would fall apart in the case of a climate change disaster. First of all, you wouldn't get gasoline. Most people use gasoline. Secondly, the highways would be all blocked up. You couldn't get from one point to another, even assuming you had some legitimate place to go. In other words, you're staying at home. You don't have power. You don't have health support. You don't have food. You don't have water. What a life! And somebody has to step in. And what my question here is, and you mentioned this, we have a business community And of course, they're all dedicated to making a profit. They're all dedicated to staying alive and paying their staff and achieving their mission. We also have a nonprofit sector, like Life of the Land. How much could we rely on the business sector, and for that matter, the nonprofit sector, actually roll up their sleeves, hand out food, repair systems that needed physical repair, and generally make the community come together again? How much are they prepared to do that? How much are they resourced and staffed to do that? How much would they do as a matter of business decision?
I think two examples of the community coming together and supplying a lot of support, whether you favored it or didn't favor it, was the resistance to TMT and the Lahaina fire. But those were both localized situations. And if you're talking about a disaster on a statewide level, then you can't have the entire state coming to support an area because everybody has to support what's going on in their own community. And while the highways may be blocked, it's all the roads leading to the highway that would have trees falling against them. So you couldn't even get to the highway if you wanted to get to the highway. And so um, a disaster that strikes much greater than a small community would have a much harder time with businesses and everybody coming together and helping out.
My final area of inquiry with you, Henry, is that yes, we have had climate change disasters. We have had hurricanes like Iniki, and we have had the fires like Maui. And I'm wondering, looking back, and I have a friend whose home burned down. What is it, a couple of years ago in the Maui fires, and he's still struggling to rebuild that home. It's not even a question of money. It's a question of government regulation, of the Department of Planning and Permitting, of dealing with the Environmental Protection Agency, and a myriad of other organizations and obstacles. And he really isn't he isn't prepared. I mean, he can't rebuild his home, and he's with hundreds, if not thousands, of others who can't rebuild their homes. And so you would think that in Maui we would have learned something. We would have learned something in dealing with these disasters, whether it be fire or any other community disaster. And my question to you is, given the hurricanes and all the loss and damage and discombobulation, disruption, societal and economic that we have had with the hurricanes, and of course with the Maui fires, what have we learned? Has the community identified certain lessons? Has the community taken specific steps to prevent this kind of logjam from happening again?
Let me throw in Paradise in California, where the fire ripped through a few years before Lahaina, and they're currently at only one quarter of their population prior to the fire. So we need somehow to figure out how to rebuild communities quickly that are hit. And that's a huge issue area, well beyond my capacity. The one that scared me the most was Hurricane Lane in 2018 that came within 24 hours of a category 2 to category 4 hit on Oahu. And that would have altered everything. And it should have been a wake up call, a serious wake up call. We need to begin looking at things at a huge statewide, multi silo area. But even when you went to the legislature this past year and there were discussions on, um, for example, figuring out ways of utility borrowing money cheaper through securitization, there's a total lack of participation, even by the regular players in that, because these issues are so complex, most people stay away. We need to have a much more serious fe- state and island and county planning process to prepare for this.
Yes, I agree. But your comment reminds me of one great concern that I have. When the smoke clears and people wandering around, without having a life, it reminds me of the commemoration of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What were they doing? What do people do? They're wandering around in a society that has been destroyed. It's really, sad to think about it. And there are people talking about it now to evaluate what happened after those atomic blasts. We may have people like that here, depending on the severity of the storm and the extreme weather and so forth. So the society is damaged. The economy, by definition, is damaged. And what is the most notable thing that will happen is that people, as soon as they can, will find an airplane and get out of town because there's nothing for them here. It's those young people we always worry about. They can't find a life here. They can't find a job. They can't buy a home. They can't live here. And so they leave. And then we have sort of an inverted bell curve for Hawaii special. And if Hawaii has bad weather, that doesn't mean the whole country has bad weather. It doesn't mean the whole world has bad weather. They're going to leave. And when we look again, we will find them gone. Your thoughts about that?
I have a feeling that yes, some people will leave, and that's a real tragedy, and it's a tragedy that we can't keep our young people here. But at the same time, I think the disasters are going to be happening globally, and people may feel more secure staying here than heading to the continent and figuring a month of 110-degree weather followed by rainstorms. And the continent is not necessarily a solution. I think the entire world needs to wake up and figure out what's going on. So I think some people will stay here. A lot of people will stay here and figure out how to rebuild. Um, and we definitely need business and nonprofit and everybody helping out. But you're right. A lot of people um, worry about the economy. The economy will be shattered if we have a major hurricane hit. Um, so
Yeah.
we have a mountain of work ahead of us and not much time.
Strikes me, Henry Curtis of Life of the Land, is that life of the land and your work for life of the land for the environment has never been so important, so relevant, so necessary.
My partner, Kat Brady, is the real social justice advocate, and she brings a wealth of social consciousness and awareness to Life of the Land. I may be more nerdy in that, but Kat Brady is really focusing on the people related issues, and that's also really critical.
Well, you can't protect and rebuild a society without considering those people issues for sure. So hats off to Cat Brady. No kidding. You guys been working together for decades and decades, and the two of you collectively are more important to the future of Hawaii than you've ever been. That's my opinion. Anyway, Henry, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our esteemed guest, Henry Curtis, Executive Director of Life of the Land. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Preserving Our Planet, and we've been discussing Hawaii. Is Hawaii prepared for climate change? Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon. Aloha.
Aloha.